We can waste a lot of time trying to perfect something that's by definition impossible to perfect.
You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and this is episode 68. In this episode, I welcome Dr. Max Lempriere. Max has a PhD in political science from the University of Birmingham. He has spent 4 years offering training and support to doctoral students, sending out motivational emails to over 25,000 students each week. He has helped thousands with writing courses, editorial support, and coaching. Recently, he created an online community platform that offers guidance, mentorship, support, and training to students all over the world. Max, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Why don't we start today's episode with you sharing what motivated you to create your company, The PhD People?
Oh, well, I'm not sure how many people listening to or watching this can sympathize, but when I was doing my PhD, which I graduated from in 2017, I found it, I wouldn't say it was awful. There was lots of positives in it, but it was a real struggle. And there were some moments in it that were particularly kind of troublesome. And the problem that I had was, well, not necessarily the problem, but what I was doing was I wasn't talking to anyone about the PhD. I was keeping the fact that it was so difficult to myself. And the longer you do that, the more you can convince yourself that you're the problem, which I very much did. I went the whole way through it thinking that I was an idiot, right? And, you know, I should understand all this. I should find this straightforward. It wasn't until I finished, and it wasn't until about a year after I graduated, that I realized that tons of other students felt the same, and tons of other students were keeping it to themselves and internalizing that thought of I'm an idiot or I'm not good enough. So I then decided to make it my mission to make other students' lives a little bit easier than mine was when I was doing my PhD. And that's been through creating a space to bring students together, to bring them out of their silos of one, to actually have an upfront and open conversation about the things that are difficult and to bring those feelings to the forefront, but also to provide support, emotional support, well-being support, practical support to students that are lacking it for one reason or another. So that's why I do what I do. It's to help other students and make their lives a little bit easier.
So Max, we have similar life purposes, which it's always fun to talk to someone who's on the same path. And when I think about it, I graduated almost 20 years before you did, and it was the same story. People suffering in silence.
Yeah.
Right? Because think about the person who goes on to get a terminal degree.
Yeah.
They're exceedingly successful in many aspects of their lives. And then you're in this position and you start second guessing yourself when things don't come as easily as they used to.
Exactly. You were on the same page. Over the years, I've been coaching a lot of students, and what you realize, and I don't know if you're guilty of this, I certainly am. PhD students I work with tend to be perfectionists, right? It's kind of what's got them there in the first place. And on the whole, I know I'm making some generalizations here, but broadly speaking, all through their kind of school education and through high school, through their undergraduate degree and through their master's, chances are they've been top of the class or near to it, right? But not just that, like in control. They know, they're hitting the high grades, they know how everything works, they're comfortable in that space. And to a greater or lesser extent, actually forming an identity around this. I certainly did that, forming my identity around being that person who's, just knows their way through the academic system. You then start on a PhD program and you don't know what's going on. And everything is you're way out of your depth, right? On day one of the PhD, almost all the way through, you're way out of your depth. It's kind of the point, right? But you're so used to being in an environment where not just you can succeed, but that the path to getting there, being dumped into this environment where you haven't got a clue what's going on, where the stakes are actually quite high and you're in this competitive environment. And it's natural, if you're so used to being in that position, to freak out and then create space, as I say, for these feelings of inadequacy or feelings of idiocy, which are also common.
I've had a number of guests talk about the imposter syndrome, which is basically what you just described. These feelings of, oh my gosh, am I supposed to be here? And they're so common. They're well researched nowadays in academia. Do you see a lot of students coming to you who are suffering from this imposter syndrome?
I mean, I still feel it myself, right?
You know what? I love that you said that, Max, because I actually argue the imposter syndrome is prevalent if you're a human being.
Yeah. It doesn't.
But if you're going to be honest, you're always wondering.
Exactly. I remember the answer to your question is we it's one of those, again, without making generalizations, it's one of those common pain points that students struggle with. It's imposter syndrome. So it is something that we touch on a lot and we talk to a lot and we work through in the workshops we run or in the community space that we've got. It's a common conversation or a common focal point. One thing that really changed my perspective on imposter syndrome, if I can just come in at a different angle to it, was, in fact, I've got two stories here. One is a personal one, and one is one that happened to me. The other is an anecdote that I remember reading somewhere online, but has some nice kind of fluency to it. And it was, I won't rehash it because I won't do it justice, but it was telling a story of Neil Gaiman was at a drinks reception in the 70s, and he was talking to Neil Armstrong. And so this was after Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and Neil Armstrong was conveying to Neil Gaiman his feelings of being a fraud and feelings of getting found out. He couldn't quite understand why he'd been invited to this drink reception as a kind of guest of honor. But he was convinced that he was, that's what had made a mistake. And Neil Gaiman was saying, well, if Neil Armstrong feels like an imposter, then we all do, right? And then something more close to home, when I was towards the end of my PhD, I was working a lot with a professor in my department at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And this woman was very, very esteemed, the kind of one of the dominant figures in her field, and objectively, right? She's honorary professorships, numerous accolades, a member of very prestigious kind of academic circles. And she was invited to be a speaker at a very prestigious conference. And they were going to fly her over to Sydney and put her up in a five-star hotel and, the works. And she was confiding in me, like a bit off the record, and saying to me, and that even though she was at the end of her career and very distinguished, she was still convinced. She said, maybe this is the presentation, maybe this is the keynote where they're going to find me out. And my jaw dropped, and I couldn't believe it, because you've got someone there that's objectively, esteemed and distinguished and successful, but even she feels like an imposter. And that really brought it home. It kind of like animated that Neil Gaiman story with a personal anecdote and made it more real.
And have you found that just talking about it helps work through the emotions, getting students together so that they hear stories like this and go, wow, it's not just me. Other people are experiencing this. I might be okay.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there is an important caveat to that, which is, the thing is, you tell someone that what they're suffering from is imposter syndrome, and chances are they don't believe you. They're like, no, but you don't understand. I really am an idiot. So that's the first hurdle, is to actually make people believe it, right? You can tell them all day long. But I guess it's important to say, I think you touched on this earlier, it doesn't go away. It's not something you can cure necessarily. It's just giving it space and almost personifying it and giving it that kind of reality can help you live with it a bit more and help you realize that it's just going to be a little lingering emotion that you've got and something that you're going to just have to live with, but which isn't difficult, once you become aware of it. I became aware of how prevalent it was. I used to send out a daily motivational email. At one stage, we had about almost 10,000 people getting it. This was after my PhD, and they were often kind of relaying my own experience through creating the business. There's a lot of similarities in creating a business and doing a PhD. They're both, you're out of your depth, they're uncertain, you don't really know if you're making the right decisions, you're kind of on your own. And I was kind of using the journey I had setting the business up and just kind of relating it to the PhD experience. A lot of the conversations I was sending out in these emails, daily emails, were around imposter syndrome. Where I really got aware of how common it was the number of people replying to those emails and saying, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only one." And so ever since then, it's become a more prevalent discussion point. And it does, you're right, it helps just to say, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not an idiot. You're one of the most smartest people on earth. Don't let anyone else convince you otherwise.
Just recently, I was invited to speak at a doctoral student support group, and someone asked a question, in the little chat bar that kind of picked up on this notion of imposter syndrome. And when I started talking about it, the chat exploded with people going, "Oh my goodness, that's exactly how I feel." And what was interesting was weeks later, the person who had organized this event reached out to me and said, "Now we hold each other accountable when we're in this group and someone starts having self-doubt. We have a name for it. We say, oh, might that be the imposter syndrome?" And I loved your perspective of acknowledging, listen, there's probably always going to be some level of this. Just recognize it, have a name for it, and manage it. Don't let it take you over. Learn how to manage it.
Yeah, you're right. It's easier said than done though, right?
Well, that was going to be my next question. Do you have tips or tricks or techniques that you suggest to students? One thing that I have heard from other students is I find that if I submit things to conferences, and often they have a student section, and they get accepted, and I get over my anxiety and my fear of being found out, and I go to these events, and now so many of them are online, it helps me. It gives me evidence. Wait, here's evidence that maybe I can do this. People asked great questions. People were very encouraging. So almost having to work through that anxiety and putting yourself out there as a way to help manage.
Yeah, it's kind of like exposure therapy, isn't it, really? A lot of aspects of doing a PhD are new. They're for students, they're things, broadly speaking, things that they've likely never done before. So, for example, you're presenting at conferences. It's probably the first time they've ever, you've ever kind of written something in that way, and then certainly stood up in front of a room of people who are experts in their field and presented it to them. That's scary. That's really scary. I mean, that's scary even if you've done it 100 times. That's still kind of scary, right? So if it's the first time you've ever done it, it's terrifying. It's slightly easier each time you do it, and it is quite validating when you have done it and you realize that the earth, the world didn't burn down, like everything's still fine, right? But what I would add to that is it's important to, and this is true not just of conferences, but of the PhD experience in general. Academia as an institution is built on critique. That's kind of the whole point of it, right? If you think about your literature review is an exercise in critiquing the work of other people. Not in a mean way, it's not personal, it's just you're seeking to advance knowledge by building on that which has come before it. And you do that through working through the problems or the shortcomings or the gaps that exist with that body of literature. And it's the same when you're presenting at a conference or workshop, or even sending your paper into a journal for review. You're going to get feedback. This is true with your supervisor as well, right? You're going to get negative feedback on it. You might be lucky and get all positive, great questions. And if you do, that's fantastic, right? But you're probably going to get a few people that are picking holes in it. Whether that's in written comments, whether that's questions in the audience, whatever, or reviewers' comments, whatever it may be. When you do get those, it can be really disheartening, and it can feed that voice you've got in your head that's trying to convince you you're an idiot, the imposter. It can give it ammunition, and you can get something like that comes along, and that's all the ammunition it needs to go, see, I told you, you're an idiot, right? But just remind yourself that that's part of the process. That's the nature of academia, is to critique and to criticize the work of others, and it's not personal.
It is part and parcel of the process. And what I have trained myself to do is before a document's going out to review to other committee members, I make sure now, I've learned, this took me a while to learn, but to help people manage this when I'm mentoring students is to say, this is what's going to happen. You and I think this is pretty darn good. We've been working on this for months. We think the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. Now it's going out and it's going to be reviewed by people with fresh eyes. And I want to tell you what's going to happen. Chances are you're going to get substantial constructive feedback. And I want you to be ready for that. And that is part of the process. That is how science is created, right? You said it's the nature of the process. It's the nature of doctoral level inquiry that academics are going to critique your work. And I think for most people, that's a relatively new situation that they find themselves in.
It is. And it's important actually to take the bigger picture with it and realize that through having that kind of interaction and through getting that kind of feedback, however hard it may be in the moment, particularly if you do, have a big imposter syndrome, what's happening through multiple exposures to it. So as you go through the PhD experience and you do get more and more of this kind of constructive feedback, what it's doing is building a resilience in you, right? And you don't realize it's happening. This is true with a lot of soft skills around the PhD. You don't realize them until way down the line when the same thing in a different context happens to you again. So I'm talking here from experience. Even just yesterday, I had something I tried with the community kind of flopped, right? It was a new event format we were trying out and it just didn't work, right? It didn't gain traction. Rather than see that as like, fine, that's part of the learning, it's all part of the experience, right? That little incident there fed that monster in me that's still in me, like that's saying, look, you're an idiot, right? The whole thing's going to fail. But what you're able to do is very quickly notice it's happening, very quickly notice that voice is being fed and stop feeding it. And that comes, the ability to do that and the ease to do that comes from the number of times you had to do it during your PhD, because you train that muscle up. You're training yourself up to not listen to that voice in your head that's convincing you you're an idiot.
Which makes you quite marketable. I mean, I know we're kind of starting to digress a little bit with that comment, but you mentioned soft skills that you pick up while you're going through a terminal degree. And I have spoken to people in HR, business owners that will say, well, here's what I know. If I hire someone who has a doctorate, I know they can take feedback in the spirit that is intended. I know that they are great at dealing with challenging conversations. There's all these things that you might not notice, but once your degree is over, you realize, wow, I learned a lot more than just what my research topic was about.
Yeah. And that happens for a long time after you finished. It might not be years down the line it might not be years until you then have to use that same skill set again in a different context. And you do, and you think, wow, I really found that straightforward. And then you can trace the links back to your PhD. I'm thinking, for example, here of, I mean, the obvious one is, well, may not be obvious actually. It certainly wasn't to me when I was doing mine, is the project management skills you're building are just exceptional, right? You're going to become out of it a great project manager because you've spent the last however many years managing this project alone with very fluid kind of boundaries around it. The big one for me, I find, is what the process of doing a literature review is teaching you. It's teaching you the ability and the skill to condense extraordinary amounts of information into a coherent and logical narrative. So when you next come to, after the PhD, when you next come to kind of research a new topic in your new role or brush up, learn new skills, read, textbook or things like that, you're able to learn completely new topics and areas really quite quickly and quite straightforward, because you can find everything you can possibly find online or in textbooks or whatever, and just kind of manage it and just process it. That's a superpower, and you don't realize it until a long time after.
The ability to distill complex and sometimes conflicting information is a huge superpower. I don't care what industry you're in.
Yeah.
And I think employers appreciate that, as well as the ability to take feedback. I don't know about you, but I crave it now, even though sometimes it's hard to hear. I'm not going to say that it's not. But if I send something out to review and I get back, hey, Heather, that sounded great, I'm thinking, wait a second, did you really read it? Because come on, there's got to be something I can change to make it better.
Yeah. Nobody's perfect, right? It's that thing.
Right.
And nothing is perfect.
If you do engage in your doctoral process, understanding these other skills that you're gaining, you go off to your next, whatever that may be, teaching, research, creating your own business, and you're then the type of person that understands that you're not perfect, that nobody's perfect, there's always room for improvement. And I think that is, again, a key characteristic of a successful person.
Yeah. And it's a lot of the work I do with students when I do one-on-one stuff. What I find myself saying quite often there is not just that your perfection is elusive, not just in the PhD, but in life in general. The quicker you can realize that, the better, right? That nothing's ever perfect. But there's an important caveat to that again, and that's we can waste a lot of time trying to make something perfect. Okay, we can waste a lot of time trying to perfect something that's by definition impossible to perfect. There's a concept, the 80-20 principle. We can spend 20% of our time getting something 80% complete, but then we can spend the remaining 80% of the time trying to find that last 20%. Okay. And another way of thinking about that, and something I say to my students quite a lot, is get out of your perfectionist mindset when you're writing stuff, because your 80% is other people's 100%. When they're looking into you, that's their 100%. So don't waste your time on that last 20%, because it will take up most of your time and you'll never quite get there. This is a waste of time. That's particularly true in the literature review. Students waste a lot of time trying to tie up every single loose end in the literature review, and you could do a literature review for the rest of your life and you'll never finish it. So it's about knowing when you've reached that 80%, knowing when it's good enough, and then moving on.
Max, as you were talking, I was recollecting back when I was doing my literature review and following every breadcrumb trail. I think just 5 more articles, and then I'd look at that reference section, that reference list. I'm like, I just need this one. I know I just need this one. And my chair saying, Heather, you need to stop.
Yeah.
You need to stop and you need to start writing. So there is this concept of good enough. And I think, again, when you think of the type of personality who's drawn to a terminal degree, you're never okay with just good enough, right? But when it comes to your dissertation or doctoral project, which is just a demonstration project, it's not your life's work, is my opinion. There is a such thing as good enough, and embracing that good enough can be the difference between you finishing or not.
Exactly. And having fun in the process, or as much fun as you can while doing a PhD, or enjoying the process, right? It's important to think about what good enough means there, right? So good enough's got a fluid definition. So, I mean, actually, before I go down there, it's the reason why you're aiming for good enough and not perfection is just the amount of work you've got to do. You haven't got time to make everything perfect, or even try and make everything perfect. You haven't got time to do that. The more you can embrace the good enough mentality or mindset, the more time you're getting back, because you can just move on to other things. But good enough for what? So good enough can mean different things in different contexts. When you're submitting your first draft of your chapter to your chair or your supervisor, it just has to be good enough for them. Okay. When you're submitting your first article for review, it has to be good enough for the reviewers. When you're submitting your viva, ultimately your thesis, to your examination committee, it has to be good enough for them. Thinking in those terms kind of gets you away from the perfectionist mindset. There's quite a famous article called "It's a PhD, Not a Nobel Prize." I like to remind my students of that, but also it's a nice sort of mantra for life in general. That this sounds really disingenuous. I don't mean it to, but it's only a PhD. We can go into PhDs thinking it has to be groundbreaking, it has to be perfect. Again, to use that word, it doesn't. It has to be a PhD. It's another way of thinking about that is you're an apprentice. You're good enough for your final exam. We call it a viva over here in the UK. The people on that committee that ultimately make the decision about whether or not you pass, they know that your research is never going to be perfect. They know it's not a Nobel Prize. They know that there are going to be problems with it. They know that, but they want to see whether you passed your apprenticeship, whether you've got what it takes to go forward into the world and say, I am Dr. So-and-so and I am a researcher and I have these skills, fully aware that there are tons of things that didn't work out in the process.
What I heard you say there was, as a student, to really be open to calibrating this good enough at different stages, right? To not just go for this perfection at every moment in time, but to work with your advisor, your chair. I'm working on my chapter 1. Can I send you an outline? I've been working on this for a couple months. I think it's good enough for you. I now need your feedback, understanding there's going to be iterations. And I think if you have good communication with the people who are advising you, and also a support system who can help you, it makes it a lot easier to manage.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot to be said for owning up to the imperfections. And this is a difficult thing to do if you are a perfectionist and you're used to operating in that way. Say when you're sending a draft to your chair or your supervisor, is just listing the things that haven't been finished yet, listing the things that you know are a bit messy and don't quite fit. But more importantly, when you get to the final stage with your final exam, your viva, and this actually relates a little bit to what you said earlier, if you present your final thesis and claim it's perfect and there's nothing wrong with it, that's a big red flag for the committee, for the examiner, whatever the language you're using is. Because, as I say, they know it's not perfect. And if you're claiming that it is, that's a big red flag, because it can mean one of two things. One is you're not aware of the imperfections, which in itself is a problem. That's a key part of the apprenticeship, is knowing your shortcomings. Or the other is you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes and you're trying to convince them of something, and neither of which are particularly good. The alternative, and this is something that's hard to do, and it goes against a lot of the perfectionist mindset, is to have a section in your thesis or in your paper or whatever you're submitting formally, a section that explicitly talks about limitations and the things that don't work and the things that you wish had done differently and the things that didn't go to plan. In my opinion, it's like a requirement and it should be in there, but it shows the level of humility, being confident enough to own up to your shortcomings. And it also shows, an awareness of what perfect research, quote unquote, research looks like and why yours isn't. And that's really key. Being humble is really key.
Humility is huge, and it's very common here in the States, I don't know about over there, to ask a question exactly like that. We want to hear from you. What went wrong? What would you have done different? So that we can see that there's this acknowledgement of course, I've learned through this process. Of course, I would do something different now, because that's what it is, a learning process.
Yeah, exactly. It can be difficult, again, to say, if you're a perfectionist, it can be difficult to lean into that question and see it as a constructive thing rather than an attack. It's helpful there let's put ourselves in the final exam, in the viva context. The people who are ultimately deciding upon your outcome, the examiners, the committee, or whatever system you've got, they're not there to catch you out. They're not there to lay booby traps so they can fail you and laugh about it, right? They want to help you. They're there to take you on that final little bit of the journey and guide you through. They want to see you come across the finishing line. It's a bit like the feedback from the audience when you've got someone that asked what can appear to be an unhelpful question. It's the same thing. It's part of the process. They're going to be asking questions that the perfectionist in you or the imposter in you could be portraying as or construing as an attack. But they're not. They're just helpful, constructive criticism. They want you to pass ultimately. I'm sure you've got a few bad apples, but broadly speaking, they want you to pass. They want you to be part of the club that they're part of. And they've been where you are as well. They know what it's like, which is why, as I say, when you're claiming it's perfect, they can see straight through it because they know from their own experience that it's not.
Yeah, that's impossible. Dr. Stewart on her podcast gave such a helpful paradigm that if you had the perspective that those questions and those comments that are coming to you from people who genuinely want you to succeed, it totally changes how you perceive that feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I ever fully subscribed to this, but I can see it now looking back on my own PhD. Up until the PhD program, there's always been a power dynamic, right? There's the teacher and then the student. And we can take that with us in the PhD program because we are encountering professors and so on. I mean, I don't know about you, but I never really fully saw the other, the other members of academia as colleagues. I always saw them as teachers in that power dynamic role, right? And that translated to the viva, where I think if you can really recognize and embrace the idea that you are colleagues, particularly in the viva session. And I guess there's a certain degree in which you are a student and teacher in the early stages when you're learning, but particularly at the final stage, when you're in that final exam and that final presentation, you are colleagues, right? You've done it pretty much. There's a final hurdle. Even if you get corrections, you've done the hard work. You know this stuff inside out. So you are sitting down with colleagues who are, broadly speaking, on your level, as it were. And it takes away a lot of the fear, and it takes away a lot of the intimidation that can exist in that, because there's no real power. There's a power dynamic in the sense that they're a gatekeeper, but you're talking to someone on the same level now by that stage. That's the whole reason you're there.
Right, to become a peer. They're training you to become a peer. And I remember the first seminar when I went off to graduate school working on my PhD, the faculty introduced themselves with their first and their last name without the title doctor. And I remember going to my advisor, my doctoral advisor, and calling her Dr. Lackman. And she said, "No, we don't do that here. My name's Margie, because you're becoming my colleague. And we have found that if we maintain that power, like you said, they're gatekeepers. There's always going to be a little bit of a power dynamic there. But if we keep using those words, it's harder for you to step into the role we want you to play, which is as our colleague. That's going to take place over a number of years. So yes, it's going to feel uncomfortable at the beginning, but by the time you're sitting there, we call it an oral defense. By the time you're sitting there at your Viva, your oral defense, you're speaking to a group of colleagues.
Yeah. Who are there to help you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And change whatever field you're in together. Science is very collaborative.
That's the paradox. It is very collaborative, but it's also very kind of competitive, or it can feel quite competitive, and it can also we can internalize the idea that showing your emotions or being upfront about your struggles can be seen as a sign of weakness, and that's why I think a lot of people don't do it, is they don't want to come across as weak. So yes, it is very collaborative. It's also oddly kind of competitive as well, which is no good thing.
True. Max, throughout the talk today, you've brought up some of the efforts that you've launched as part of PhD People. And I just want to say, I did ask before we started recording, is this specific to PhD? And he said, absolutely not. It's very inclusive. Do you want to talk about some of the things that you're doing, that you have done, that you have coming up?
Yeah, sure. It's a good point there. We're explicitly talking to the kind of non-traditional PhD, non-traditional doctoral programs, so professional doctorates and BBAs and things like that. So it is a very inclusive space. The PhD People's come out off of the work I've been doing for the last few years, working with PhD students. And that work was all kind of one-on-one. It was all me and a student in a kind of just in a two-way dialogue. The PhD People exist. I mean, the clue's in the name, really. It's about bringing students together. And that's in two ways. It's broadly, it's through workshops and training events, but it's also through an online learning and community platform that we built. And they kind of feed into one another. There's some overlap, but it is, it's possible to choose one or the other as well as both. And the core driving idea is, for one reason or another, a lot of students need a bit of extra support. But quite a lot of students, for one reason or another, fall through the cracks, and they might have absent supervision, or their department or institution isn't funded properly, so there's not great training being provided. And the trouble is, if you're at University A and you're not getting great support, you can't go to University B and tap into theirs. They all exist, in effect, in private silos. Now, there are spaces online. There are some great spaces. There's some great spaces on Twitter. There's some Discord servers. There's some great blogs where you can go to piece together kind of a supplementary support. And we're contributing to that space. Through the work I've been doing for the last few years, I've built up a huge network of academics who are experts in this space. So these are people who devote their academic career to researching the PhD experience, right? It's not a secondary thing. It's their academic research interest. And what we're in effect doing is connecting those students that need the extra support and can't get it with the academics who are experts and also very willing to offer support, and just creating a space, whether through workshops or through the community, where they can come together and supplement the learning.
And Max, your model is such a brilliant idea, because you mentioned that competitive nature, and sometimes you may be at a place where you don't feel like you're in a position to talk about the challenges you're having because the culture is so competitive. And so it's as if you're creating this safe space to say, come, we understand you, and we can help you get through these challenges, these hurdles, these barriers that you're experiencing.
Yeah, and we're explicitly creating space to talk about those things. There's three strands to the kind of support that we give. The first is writing support. So how to write your literature review, how to write your abstract, and so on, right? The second strand is practical stuff, how to prepare for your oral exam, how to publish your first article, how to find grant funding. But the third one, and the one that is real desperately needed, is talking to emotional and well-being. And that's things like having workshops on imposter syndrome, having workshops on self-doubt and things like that, and creating space for those discussions. And that's the really interesting space. I mean, they're all interesting, but that's the one where you have those aha moments where students kind of finally see that there's nothing wrong with them because there's been a space created where there probably hasn't been one before.
Yeah, the well-being of people in doctoral programs is receiving increased attention. I mean, it's been something people have been concerned about for a while, but even more so as the world has changed and many programs have had to move to hybrid or online models. I always say to my students, practicing self-care and viewing yourself as a whole person counts as working on your research. So if there's a day where you can't bear to sit down and get into the library, but you go on a walk or you pull out your musical instrument or paint or draw or do some deep breathing, that you should count that as working on your research because it's helping you gain the clarity you need.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best thing you can do is nothing at all, right?
Yes. Or what appears to be nothing at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Still, you need it. There's a diminishing returns kicks in, right? And there's this, and I'm guilty of it as well. I don't know if you are, but I can find myself falling into this trap with working on the business. Is you want to grind and you want to put the hours in and you want to burn the candle at both ends, but it's counterproductive. It's just completely counterproductive because sure, on paper you might be doing X number more hours, but those hours are way less productive than if you just stopped, went for a walk, had a nap, like whatever, right? Did some self-care and then came back to it, maybe with fresh eyes or the next day. Yeah. Doing nothing at all is still a relevant thing to do in your PhD.
And I think it's hard, again, for the personalities that are drawn to that. But if you need evidence, there's more and more research that is supporting this idea that you said. There's a point of diminishing returns where you're better off taking a nap. Here's the permission out there if you're tired. Max and Heather are saying, take a nap. It's going to do you good.
Yeah, right. And tell your supervisor you were working really hard on your PhD. And part of that
count it.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things we run is it's a monthly peer-to-peer meetup. It's called Research. And it's a peer-to-peer meetup where PhD students can talk about issues around mental health and well-being. And it's actually run by a PhD student themselves. It's someone that's at the final year of their PhD who's quite proactively found herself early on in the PhD program having these thoughts and emotions. And she started to talk to her peers about it and realized there needs to be a discussion about it. So she created these spaces informally at her host institution. And she now works with us to create these in our community, these research spaces where we bring together students. And it's a really powerful arena, particularly because there's faculty, I'm not faculty, but there's no one in position of authority there, right? Everyone is a PhD student and it's facilitated by PhD students and attended by them. And it's a really powerful space to have some real game-changing moments, game-changing realizations by students that they're not on their own and there's nothing wrong with them because they're feeling this way. It's not because of them, it's because of other things external to them.
In addition to that group, we are recording this in early 2022, but you've got something exciting launching in March.
That's
you
right.
Want to tell the audience about that?
Yeah, so we have a regular calendar of workshops and training events continually. So February is our writing season. So we're looking at writing workshops and writing boot camps and writing retreats. But one thing we're really, really excited about, and it's been something that we've had planned for a while, is tapping into the power of cohorts and group learning. There's a huge body of research and it's intuitive, right? That suggests that we learn better as groups. We learn better when we see the same people every time we check in. Right. Every time we attend a workshop or a seminar or whatever it may be, if it's the same group, you build relationships and you build community and you learn better. So we're launching a cohort of our own. It's a multi-week cohort program that will take you on a journey from start to finish, and it's oriented towards people in the final year of their doctoral program. It covers all sorts of different formats, and it will be workshop programs, so 1 a week or 2 a week, depending on the week. It will feed into our community, so there'll be space to connect with people on the cohort, and it will take you through the key steps and milestones in the final year things like how to prepare for your oral defense with some mock preparation, how to publish your first article, how to apply for a job, how to edit your thesis, and all these kind of key milestones. And we'll really tap into the cohort effect. So if you're interested in checking that out, then head over to the website. It's thephdpeople.com, and you can find more details on there. And we are super, super excited. It's going to bring together all the expertise and talent that we've got in our network. As I said earlier, the academics who are experts in this stuff. We have someone, for example, doing a workshop on preparing for the Viva that's published textbooks on how to prepare for the Viva, right? That's his thing. It's something I wish I had. I mean, I would say that, I suppose I'm biased, but I really do wish I had that when I was doing my PhD, which is why I do it, right? That's exactly why I'm creating it, because I wish I had that.
It's a great niche, Max, because as you get towards the end, there's a lot of fatigue. And so having that extra support to just see you across the finish line. And then when you're done, the publishing, the job search, often colleges, universities kind of drop off and there's not a lot of support there. They're kind of like, we did our job. You have your degree in hand. Best of luck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there can be, I mean, I didn't really think about it. I don't know about you, but when I was doing mine, I knew that I wasn't going to stay in academia. I'd still do a little bit of work on the sidelines for academia, but I knew that I wasn't going to get a faculty position. And that was, I don't know if anyone listening to this can maybe relate, but that was a huge bummer for me when I realized that, oh, I don't want to be here, like after the PhD. That was a huge setback, because my whole identity up until that point had been, I'm an academic, I'm going to be an academic. And then having the realization, which I resisted initially, like, oh no, I don't actually want to do this. Right? I had a huge identity crisis. Huge. I was like, well, if I'm not that, then who am I? So I kind of ignored it, and I didn't really think about what I was going to do after my PhD. I kind of did everything I should have done. I published and, all the rest of it. But it wasn't really till I got to the end that I thought, oh, now what am I going to do? And I kind of wish that the university had given me more support. I mean, I got there in the end and worked out my path, but I wish I had a bit more support from the university about those kind of after the PhD things. What next? You've achieved your dream, right? You spent 4 years working on this thing. I'll never forget the day I submitted my PhD. It was the strangest moment, because I took 4 years. I guess some people listening to this have probably taken longer, and if you're part-time, then longer still. But you get to the end and you submit it, and then you're like, now what?
Yes.
You're so used to having this presence in your life. And then it just disappears one day, and it's really unsettling. It can take a while just to ease into that new space that you're in, the post.
And to process that. Max, I think that may be a topic for a whole nother episode.
Yeah, sure.
Integrating post the degree. I want to make sure I will have all the contact information in the show notes, but I want to make sure people heard the website. It's thephdpeople.com, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Max, thank you so much for the work that you're doing to support students that are out there. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you today.
Thank you. It's great that you've created this space as well. So thank you to you, and thank you for inviting me on. It's been a real pleasure. And I want to say, if anyone wants to contact me, it's beyond applying for the cohort or anything like that. People listening to this can check onto the website and just reach out if they just want to offload or want to just connect with somebody. I'm always available, and I always respond to all the emails I get, because I know that if you're in that place where, then the PhD has a lot of these, even a good PhD and a streamlined one has moments of darkness in it. And often it's in those moments that we're kind of most desperate. So I've definitely got a space, a communication channel that's open to anyone that just wants to offload. I'm listening and I'll reply. And I won't try and sell you anything. I mean that compassionately. I'll be there as a listener.
Max, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. Until then, I'm wishing you more joy in your journey. The Happy Doc Student Podcast is brought to you by expandyourhappy.com, and you can learn more there. Hey, one more thing. Just a quick reminder that the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only.